Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fifth of our SHPO training sessions. I am Pamela Riley, Historic Preservation Specialist with the PA SHPO, and as many of you know, I was formerly part of the DCED staff dedicated to assisting HUD grantees with the Section 106 review process. Thanks to Barbara Frederick, Acting Director of the SHPO Environmental Review Division, for all of her assistance in the development of these trainings and for her logistical assistance in presenting this webinar today. The purpose of today's training is to provide guidance on how to plan and manage projects which affect historic properties or are located in historic districts. Since we have already held training sessions on demolition and adverse effects, today we are focusing on the positive side of things, rehabilitation and new construction, investing in historic properties through the use of federal programs. And the photo on this opening slide is indeed a historic district, although not one in Pennsylvania. Since summer is just around the corner, and frankly, if it's in the 90s today, it's here, I could not resist sharing this photo of the Cape May Historic District, just in case any of us are really in the mood for a beach vacation. Today, we will be discussing developing appropriate rehab treatments for historic properties, an introduction to the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines for the treatment of historic properties, the golden rule of historic property rehab, repair, not replace whenever possible, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation policy statement on affordable housing as it relates to HUD projects in Section 106, the possibility of local historic districts and the need for HARB review, in addition to Section 106 review, ADA access projects and historic properties, planning streetscape improvements in historic districts, and lastly, designing compatible new construction projects in historic districts. We have lots to discuss, so let's get started. When you are planning a project involving known or potential historic properties, keep these principles in mind. As defined by Section 106 law, a historic property is one listed in or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, either individually or as a contributing element in a historic district. By using the PA Share mapping system, you can check your project location to see if any previously identified historic properties are located nearby. PA Share indicates eligible, listed, and unevaluated resources, as well as local historic districts and historic markers. Remember that PA Share represents all that the SHPO currently knows about historic properties, but new historic properties and districts are being identified all the time. So keep in mind that additional effort might be needed to evaluate a property's eligibility. As you all know from previous trainings, certain property types are more likely to meet National Register criteria. Schools, libraries, and other publicly used buildings, structures that have high architectural value, and properties that are often included in historic districts, like commercial or industrial buildings. Remember that not only buildings can be National Register historic resources. This photo shows the Johnstown bandshell built by the WPA in 1939, a National Register eligible structure in a public park. It was once proposed for demolition by the city to create more parking and saved by concerned citizens. To a large degree, the appropriate rehab treatment for historic properties just follows common sense. The Secretary of the Interior standards, often abbreviated as the SOIS, urge the retention of original features to the greatest extent possible. When existing features cannot be repaired and must be replaced, those of matching design, appearance, and material should be used. Consultation with the SHPO is needed to satisfy Section 106 and is useful in developing appropriate rehab specifications. When the rehab meets the standards, the result is a no adverse effect finding, and the project can move forward without additional SHPO consultation. If the property is located in a local historic district regulated by local zoning ordinance with an appointed Historic Architectural Review Board, known as a HARB, An additional review at the municipal level will be needed. It is always a good idea to secure the HARB Certificate of Appropriateness to include with your project submission to the SHPO. We will discuss that later in the presentation. The standards provide direction in making appropriate choices in planning repairs, alterations, and additions that may be part of a rehabilitation project affecting a historic property. The standards are detailed regarding not just the physical repair of historic buildings, but appropriate design for new additions or needed alterations like ADA improvements. The standards in their entirety can be found at the link provided on this slide. It is interesting to note that HUD-funded programs played a major role in the development of the Secretary of the Interior standards. Seeing the potential for concern about the effect of HUD-funded community block grants on historic properties, both HUD and the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation asked the National Park Service for guidance. Thus, just 2 years after the establishment of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, the National Park Service issued their first guidelines, which were finalized and updated in 1977. So it is readily apparent that the intersection of these two federal initiatives was clear from early days, and finding ways to meet the goals and interests of each program is the desired outcome. The intent of the Secretary of the Interior standards is to provide for the long-term preservation of a historic property. Preservation of the property's historic materials and character-defining features is a primary goal. The standards were developed to apply to historic properties of all types, eras, sizes, uses, and materials. They offer guidance on both exterior and interior treatments. They also address appropriate treatment for the property setting and landscape features. And they set standards for new additions to historic properties and related new construction. The standards offer guidance on 4 treatments for historic properties. Preservation focuses on maintenance and repair of existing historic materials and retention of a property's form as it evolved over time. Rehabilitation acknowledges the need to add to historic properties to meet continuing or changing uses while retaining the property's historic character. Restoration depicts a property at a particular period of time in its history while removing evidence of other periods. Reconstruction recreates vanished or non-surviving portions of a property for interpretive purposes. The standards for rehabilitation are organized around key principles. Avoid new uses for historic properties that require significant changes to historic character. Preserve historic character by retaining historic materials and avoiding alterations to character-defining features. Respect the property's authenticity and avoid rehabilitation that creates a false sense of historical development. Do not add features that never existed. Recognize that some changes over time have their own significance, like the Carrera glass storefront shown in this slide, or the decorative railing above the storefront shown in the photo to the right. Preserve distinctive features and fine craftsmanship. Avoid damaging treatments like sandblasting, as shown in this slide, and use the gentlest means possible to clean historic structures. Repair original features and materials in kind before replacement. Protect archaeological resources in the project area. New additions or new construction shall not destroy historic materials or character-defining features and be compatible in massing, scale, size, and architectural features. New additions and adjacent new construction should be designed so that if removed in the future, the form and integrity of the historic property would be unimpaired. Retain and repair when possible. Replace only when necessary. Sometimes a feature or material is too deteriorated to be repaired, or the material is no longer available for in-kind replacement, or it is cost prohibitive to replace using the same material due to high maintenance costs or other reasons. As knowledge of historic rehabilitation practices has grown over time, guidance offered in the treatment standards has evolved too. For instance, certain types of metal windows are prone to corrosion, and replacement in kind is not required by the standards. Instead, windows of matching appearance but improved material are recommended. As you can see in the before and after photo shown on this slide, the character-defining features of this duplex were preserved and repainted, not replaced. The decorative porch, the cedar shingles on the dormer were repainted. The distinctive decorative multi-paned windows were retained.
Okay, at this point, we'll take a break for any questions. Again, we're using the chat function to manage your questions today, since we have such a large group. And you can open the chat box by clicking on the speech bubble icon, which is maybe at the top of your screen or the lower left-hand side. And then simply type your question in and hit enter. And we'll be taking questions throughout the presentation. So if anything occurs to you, feel free to type it in there, and we'll pause at these breaks and answer it. And if there's anything we don't get to today, we'll certainly follow up afterwards. But at this point, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions, so we'll continue to move through the presentation.
The difficulties of meeting the standards for federally funded affordable housing projects led to the development of the Advisory Council's policy statement on affordable housing. This policy can be viewed at the web link shown on this slide. The policy statement was developed after a series of meetings between interested parties, primarily HUD and the Advisory Council. While the 8 principles that were agreed upon are helpful, they are rather general and reflect common practices already in place in most SHPO offices, like focusing on the exterior features of buildings located in historic districts and taking the preservation goals of each community into account in project design. The houses in this photo are located in the Fox Ridge Historic District in Harrisburg, a National Register eligible district that is also subject to a local historic district ordinance. It is interesting to know that the Fox Ridge Historic District was created in part due to a HUD program in the 1980s, where vacant and deteriorated houses were offered for sale for $1 with a commitment to rehabilitate them to code within 2 years. Interested preservationists in the city of Harrisburg pursued historic district status, and by establishing a local historic district, insisted on design standards for acceptable rehabilitation. For that reason, many of these frame row houses retain their wood front facades and original windows. These small frame buildings provided workers' housing for nearby industries, like the Big Finks Brewery that was once located across the street from these houses. Ironically, shortly after the repeal of Prohibition, the brewery was acquired by the state and demolished to make way for the construction of the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board. One of the most subjective affordable housing guidance principles is this one. Plans and specifications should adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards when possible and practical. Reaching agreement on what is possible and practical on individual projects is sometimes not so clear or easily agreed upon. Perhaps the next two principles offer some guidance on that issue by stressing consensus building between consulting parties and streamlining the Section 106 process to respond to local conditions. The last principle, to avoid archaeological investigations when possible, is another policy already in place by many SHPOs, including the Pennsylvania SHPO. The standards are broad concepts for determining the appropriateness of work on historic property. Since the standards and the ACHP affordable housing guidance offer more general guidance than specific directives for each and every project or property, it is necessary to carefully evaluate each project and each property on a case-by-case basis in the Section 106 process. Consultation with the PA SHPO via the Section 106 review process can provide valuable insight in the planning stage of the project. Not all historic resources are the same, of course, even though they may all have equal status under the regulations. Look at the 4 houses on this slide. All are located in close proximity to one another on the same street, Pear Avenue, in the National Register listed North Side Historic District in Oil City. All 4 of them are contributing structures, but some have far more remaining character-defining features than others, so the rehab specifications for each might be somewhat different. Remember, too, that the Section 106 process does not require that missing historic features be replaced, only that existing historic features be retained to avoid an adverse effect. These houses, located in the National Register listed North Hill Historic District in Newcastle, illustrate that principle clearly as well. It is necessary to examine each building to determine which character-defining features remain and develop rehab specs that would preserve those features. Looking at these houses, all located on the same street and close together on Leisure Avenue, it's easy to see which features make these houses distinctive. The porch columns, the tile roof, the decorative windows, the bracketed cornices stand out. The setback from the street and the landscaping are important to the setting and character of the historic district. As part of Section 106, it is necessary to consider various alternatives to develop rehab specifications that conform to the standards to avoid an adverse effect finding. Plans to rehabilitate this contributing home in the Roaring Spring National Register Historic District, initially submitted to the SHPO, could have caused an adverse effect on the historic district. The federal agency and grantee worked with the SHPO and local contractors to redesign the rehab specifications to preserve the character-defining features of this house. The agreed-upon changes in the rehab specs changed the finding from adverse to no adverse effect on the historic district. The new specs call for the preservation of the decorative multi-paned windows, the triple arched window in the attic dormers, the fish scale shingles in the dormers, and the distinctive double columns on the wraparound porch. This change in the rehab specifications led to a win-win. The homeowner gets a rehab that preserved important architectural features of the house, and the SHPO and federal agency did not need to take on the added duties of resolving an adverse effect. The National Park Service has developed a full online library of guidance on preserving, rehabilitating, and restoring historic buildings. These preservation briefs, 50 in total, provide methods and approaches to preserve historic character. The most useful for HUD programs might be number 8, aluminum and vinyl siding on historic buildings, number 9, the repair of historic wooden windows, and number 37, appropriate methods for reducing lead paint hazards in historic housing. The preservation briefs can be found online at the website shown on this slide. Preservation Brief number 9 on the repair of historic wooden windows offers guidance on how to rehabilitate wood windows. Most historic wood windows can be successfully maintained, and the Secretary of the Interior standards allow for the application of storm windows to improve energy efficiency. Studies by the National Park Service and the National Trust for Historic Preservation demonstrate that the R value of properly maintained wood windows can equal that of new windows. Good quality wood windows can last for well over 100 years. And if lead paint is present on windows or other surfaces, it can be successfully encapsulated with new paint after careful wet sanding. The functional life of vinyl windows is variable. Many are guaranteed to retain their seal for only a dozen or so years and cannot be repaired. Once the seals are broken, the replacement windows must be replaced. Of course, the issue of addressing deteriorated windows is more complicated than that. In some historic districts, with and without local district zoning ordinances, property owners have already replaced original wood windows. Many local contractors are more experienced in window replacement than repair, and it may be faster and cheaper to replace windows than repair them, even if those replacement windows will need to be replaced after a relatively short period of time. Guidance on addressing significant historic windows is offered by HUD's Office of Healthy Homes and Lead Hazard Control. This online document defines significant windows as those that are original, reflect the original design intent of the building, reflect the period or regional style or building practices, reflect significant changes to the building, or are examples of exceptional craftsmanship or design. Developing window treatments for historic properties may require additional consultation with the SHPO. Another source of information on lead paint hazards is Preservation Brief number 37, which addresses lead paint hazards in historic housing and lays out a methodical approach to treatment. The first step is to identify the historic significance of the building and architectural character of its features, and the second is to undertake a risk assessment of interior and exterior surfaces to determine the lead hazards. And the third step is to evaluate the options for lead hazard control in the context of historic preservation standards. Hazards should be removed, mitigated, or managed in the order of their health threat as identified in a risk assessment. And they identify 8 primary hazards in this document. Number 1 is peeling, chipping, flaking, or chewed interior lead paint surfaces. Number 2 is lead dust on interior surfaces. And number 3 is high lead in soil levels around the house and in play areas, often regulated by state requirements. Sorry, I have an uncooperative mouse. Rehabilitation of historic buildings to allow for their continued use is encouraged, but it must be done in a way that does not affect the character of the historic property. In this historic streetscape, the fenestration pattern or arrangement of windows, decorative cornice, and brick facade are all character-defining features. The rehab of the building on the left clearly does not preserve the character-defining features of this row house or the larger historic district. There have been dramatic changes to the original pattern of windows. The building has lost its traditional cornice at the roof edge. And if such changes were proposed as part of a rehab, the project would certainly result in an adverse effect. As I mentioned before, it's important to note that in federally funded rehab projects, it's not required that missing or altered historic features be restored, just that existing historic features be retained and treated appropriately. Sometimes rehab projects need to undo or redo past unsympathetic changes. Then the building's original historic appearance is the design guide. While such dramatic remodeling of a historic commercial building is hopefully not likely to be proposed as a project subject to 106 review, these two photos show the shocking impact of insensitive rehabilitation. This property was recently submitted for a roof replacement project, and the contrast between the current appearance, shown below, and the historic one was remarkable. The black and white photo was taken in the 1980s as part of a city survey of historic properties in Williamsport. The color photo shows the current appearance and total loss of historic character through changes to window and door openings, changes to the form and shape of the building, and changes to the material and loss of architectural detailing. These photos illustrate the impact of insensitive rehabilitation on historic buildings through changes to the pattern of windows and surface materials. The fenestration pattern is very important in maintaining the rhythm of historic streetscapes. The building on the corner is not just taller than its neighbors, its window arrangement is completely different, and it is missing a decorative cornice. Materials are also a critical factor in allowing buildings to convey their historic character within the setting of a district. The application of shaggy-looking shingles to the top 2 stories of this building make it appear out of character with its neighbors. These photos illustrate the impact of insensitive rehabilitation on historic buildings through change. Oh, just realized I forgot to change slides. The covering of historic brick front on this townhouse in a historic streetscape in South Philadelphia completely changes the ability of the property to convey its historic appearance or its character. The siding has been applied not just to the brick front wall, but also to the mansard roof above it. So it is a whole facade of white siding in an intact row of red brick with a mansard slate or slate looking shingled roof. Section 106 review is required due to the use of federal funds, but some projects may also be located in local historic districts and require review by the local HARB, the Historic Architectural Review Board. The HARB often uses the Secretary's standards for making decisions about the appropriateness of work to historic buildings in local districts. Each HARB can set its own standards. While this is a separate review from the Section 106 process, this local input can be useful, and in some cases, the HARB may want to participate as a Section 106 consulting party. To check for the presence of a local district ordinance, look at the municipal website. In the illustration above, a listing of all the HARB districts in Cumberland County is provided courtesy of the Cumberland County Historical Society. This information is linked to other municipal websites, usually relating to zoning ordinances. PA Share also includes information about local historic districts. When you click on the boundaries of a historic property, including districts in PA Share, a white box pops up showing all the historic resources located there. In this PA Share map search, the Mechanicsburg Local Historic District, HDA, appears on screen 3 of the 4 screens offered. HDA refers to those local districts created under the Historic District Act. On Mechanicsburg's municipal website, a map showing the local historic district subject to the local ordinance is shown in light blue. It corresponds with the map shown on PA Share, but searching the municipal website is another way to check for local historic districts. Also on the municipal website in Mechanicsburg is a link to a reference guide for property owners in the local historic district which explains the local review process. If the proposed project is acceptable to the local HARB, a certificate of appropriateness is issued. It is advisable to check for local historic districts early in the planning process. Ideally, a copy of the certificate of appropriateness should be submitted as an attachment with all other project details to PA Share for a 106 review.
Okay, thank you, Pam. I believe that takes us to our next break for questions. We haven't received any in the chat feature since the last question break, and I don't see any others right now. So I believe we will continue forward.
Sounds good. In most situations, planning for the construction or reconstruction of an ADA access ramp is a straightforward process. The presence of historic buildings raises questions about the design of the ramp to make sure that it does not damage or obstruct character-defining features. ADA access is an important goal for all public buildings, and historic buildings are not exempt from this requirement. The length of the ramp can be slightly shortened according to ADA regulations to accommodate historic buildings, but that may not be enough to make the ramps workable on some facades. Disturbance of significant features on the primary or front facade to achieve ADA compliance are a special concern. Sometimes, when it is not possible to design a suitable front facade ADA ramp, better accommodations of the ramp can be located on the side or rear of the property. Ease of access for the users of the ramp in relation to dedicated ADA parking spaces should be considered as well. On the photo on the left, a former Masonic lodge, the front ADA ramp is unobtrusive and works well with the site topography and the location of dedicated ADA parking. In the photo on the right, the Clinton County Courthouse, located in the National Register listed Water Street Historic District in Lock Haven, designing a front facade ADA ramp was difficult in part because of the interior layout of the courthouse. Initial plans called for the ramp to be built on the front facade, but to the left, altering the symmetry of the main entrance. After discussion with the architect, the ADA ramp was moved to the side of the building to preserve both the front facade symmetry and the triple round arched front doors. Creating a ramp along the side of the building allowed for a gentle slope and avoided placing a number of off-center switchbacks directly in front of the front facade main door. The preservation brief on ADA accessibility can guide you through common issues and solutions in designed access for historic buildings. A link to that brief is provided on this slide. Anyone familiar with the topography of the state capitol grounds knows that it sits atop a substantial hill with several tiers of steps to the front entrance. An ADA logistical challenge, and the state capitol is not just a historic building, but a recognized national landmark. The original doors of the capitol are works of art that even if ramps could be constructed up the last steep tier of steps, those doors should be treated as an important character-defining feature. When a large addition was added to the Capitol in 1987 to the rear of the Capitol, ADA issues were fully addressed with a gently sloping ramp from the designated parking spaces on Capitol Street around the new fountain to a fully ADA compliant entrance doors. New elevators and escalators were also installed in the new wing to better connect the new wing to the historic main capitol for ADA access users. Generally, streetscape improvements in historic districts are not disruptive to the character-defining features of the streetscape. Even bumped-out sidewalks for pedestrian safety which alter the traditional width of the road, can be sensitively designed. Standard design curb cuts are usually not an issue, but there are some situations where the sidewalks are very narrow and historic properties are located close to the street, where specialized curb cut design might be appropriate. Likewise, street lamp design should be appropriate for its historic setting in terms of height, spacing, and design. When possible, street lamps should match existing historic street lamp patterns. Very rarely are the street lamps called out as a contributing feature in a historic district, as they are in Lewisburg. The distinctive triple round globes are a recognized symbol of the historic charm of Lewisburg. Designing streetscape improvements involves balancing all the project needs: vehicle traffic management, bike and pedestrian safety, ADA accessibility, aesthetics, cost, and the historic setting. It is important to recognize that streetscapes have changed over time, and they will continue to evolve to meet current needs. Thoughtful design can accommodate needed change. There are a number of issues to consider in designing new construction in historic districts. Size is a critical feature, including both height and massing, meaning the overall shape of the building. The new addition should be designed so that it is smaller than the original building and located to the side or rear or set back to keep the focus on the original. This slide makes it very easy to see the difference between a compatible addition to a historic building and a not so compatible one. The building on the left, a historic bank, needed a new elevator tower. It was located to the side, recessed from the original building, keeping the focus squarely on the historic front facade, and built of matching materials and colors. Even the design of the windows emulates the round arch of the historic windows on the front facade. The building on the right has a very visible two-story rooftop addition of a different color and material. The historic building appears to be wearing a modern hat. New construction in historic districts follow basic principles of historic resource management and good design. This major addition, built behind the historic Royal Theater on South Street in Philadelphia, preserves only the front facade of the old building. Generally, facadectomies, where all but the front of the building is demolished, are not a desired preservation outcome. And due to the cost, they are seldom put into place. However, preserving the front of the building is far superior to losing the building completely. The Royal Theater was a significant Black cultural site where many famous singers and musicians performed. While the loss of the interior space is unfortunate, what remains will help tell the story of this building and the surrounding neighborhood. The new construction does dwarf the original building, which is another issue for new construction near historic properties. While it is very much not a common practice due to the cost of preserving only the exterior facade of the building, this rather spectacular example in downtown Lancaster is too interesting not to mention. When plans to construct a convention center at the historic center of Lancaster were being developed, local preservationists and residents were adamant about retaining the very lovely facade of the old Wat and Shan department store. So a much taller Marriott hotel was built behind the old Wat and Shan walls. Additional historic buildings along South Queen Street, including the law office of Thaddeus Stevens, are also incorporated into the new conference center design. The result is a very exciting modern space with links to Lancaster's history. The new construction shown on this slide, meant to replace the fire-damaged Garmin Theater in Bellefonte, followed the principles of appropriate new design in historic districts. The new construction matches the street setback, height, and massing of surrounding buildings. The fenestration pattern, choice of materials, and roof line fit the historic setting. Design features like gabled dormers draw inspiration from other buildings remaining in the historic district. The new construction shown on this slide is also appropriate for the Chestnut Hill Historic District. The front facade has a series of setbacks, creating a look of a group of smaller buildings rather than a large monolithic structure. The colors and materials and setback from the street fit the setting. This slide and the following one show the impact of new construction on the streetscape of a historic district. While the new construction design shown in the after photo is not the most sensitive and sympathetic design possible for the surrounding historic buildings, the local consulting parties did have the opportunity to offer comments that were taken into consideration by the developer. As proposed by consulting parties, the new infill housing matches the setback of the neighboring historic buildings, and the new buildings have some brick on the front facade and a similar arrangement of stories to better fit into the existing historic streetscape. However, the roof line and the window pattern are very different from the surrounding historic buildings. Window openings are much larger, and the top story of tall, light-colored, boxy shapes has little to do with the surrounding traditional streetscape. This slide shows a more compatible new construction in the same Pittsburgh Historic District. Consulting party input as part of the Section 106 review process resulted in a more sympathetic design that complements the existing buildings. Good design is a win-win situation. Vacant lots are gone and the streetscape is revitalized, making the whole neighborhood more inviting and tax generating. The new construction here fits the streetscape. Same size, scale, setback from the street, materials, and fenestration pattern. And the new buildings complement the Second Empire style of adjacent houses in a more thoughtful way than those shown on the previous slide. Sometimes input from consulting parties, like the SHPO or a local group, can introduce ideas and requests that others closer to the project might be hesitant to voice. Experts in the preservation field with experience from other projects might offer suggestions of other successful approaches used in similar situations. This photo of the town square in Mechanicsburg shows the impact of new construction on the traditional streetscape of historic districts. This insensitive new construction, which actually isn't all that new, dates from the mid-20th century. Fire destroyed a historic tall building on the square. A private landowner built this one-story mid-century modern brick building in place of the lost building. The other three corners of the square all feature taller, more substantial buildings. Of course, at the time of the rebuild, Mechanicsburg did not have a historic district or anything close to zoning ordinances focused on the historic character of the borough. And I might offer too that the planting of trees in front of the modern building helps soften the impact of a much smaller and more modern structure at this very sensitive center of the historic district. Here's another example of how an undersized building disrupts the rhythm of a historic streetscape. The one-story concrete former Rite Aid on the left, outlined in yellow, was not a good fit for the heart of Harrisburg's commercial corridor on Market Street. Interestingly enough, Rite Aid recently moved out of the one-story building and is now located across the street in a more architecturally appealing Art Deco commercial building, a former F.W. Woolworth and Company 5 and 10 cent store. And just down the street, the CVS pharmacy occupies another former 5 and Dime, possibly of the W.T. Grant Company. This big modern building looks out of place along one of Harrisburg's most architecturally significant streets, North 2nd Street. 2nd Street contains an array of outstanding examples of various architectural styles as it travels northward towards the city limits. It was home to Harrisburg's professional class, so the residences are substantial and generally well-preserved examples of late 19th century and early 20th century styles. The 2nd Street Historic District has only a few buildings like this one of distinctly different style and era of construction. Landscaping and well-designed fences or walls can help mask open breaks in the streetscape caused by demolition. Landscaping can also do much to soften the impact of varying street setbacks.
Okay, I think that brings us to our last question break. And so far, we haven't had any questions in the chat box. So if you do have them and you've been waiting and holding them to the end of the presentation, now's your chance because we're nearing the end. You can certainly type those in and we'd be happy to try to answer them. Okay, I think we have a question here. In the event of a property being unsafe and deteriorated beyond repair, what are the determining factors to be able to demolish the structure? So what would you have to consider in terms of the ability to possibly rehabilitate that building before you would consider the need for demolition, I believe is the question.
I think what we're talking about there is something we've addressed in some of our previous trainings, that you need to do an alternatives analysis. You know, the problem to be solved is a building that is unsafe and deteriorated and needs to, and is exhibiting some signs of blight. In order to determine the best course of action, you need to evaluate the alternatives to address those conditions. What the SHPO would ask for is what would be the approximate cost of rehabilitation to address the obvious code deficiencies in the building. If it needs a new roof, if it needs if it is structurally unsound, if there are concerns relating to the building's ability to, you know, bear weight, if there are collapsed stairwells, the estimate for the cost of rehabilitation does not need to be down to the last penny, but it does need to address all of the major systems of the building that would need to be evaluated and rehabilitated in order to put it back into useful function as either a commercial or residential property. When you put together that estimate, the cost estimate on what would be needed to address the issues of decay, then you would compare that to the real estate value of that property relative to other buildings in the community. If the cost to rehabilitate is far in excess of what the property would be worth on the market, then a good case can be made to the SHPO that demolition is the only economically feasible alternative. Barbara, what might I have said that I didn't say in that response?
Well, no, I think the answer is, you need to know if it's a historic property, and if it is historic, then you need to work to accommodate the project concerns, which is blight removal, along with historic property concerns. So just like you said, we need a structural analysis to determine if it is feasible to possibly rehabilitate the building, and a cost analysis for that rehabilitation. And, you know, one potential alternative to demolition that we sometimes try to consider, and sometimes I believe there are constraints, is the ability to just to potentially transfer ownership or dispose of the property so that it can be rehabilitated by a different party who would take on the financial responsibility for that rehabilitation. And I don't know if that's something you've explored much on DCED projects, Pam.
I think that the difficulties experienced by communities with derelict properties is the fear that if they are resold, that the ability to ensure that the new owner will in fact take up the needed repairs. That many properties that end up on tax sale lists are change hands several times, and all of the new owners follow the same course of not addressing the needed repairs. So I think that is a concern. And another preservation strategy, which is difficult to enact in HUD programs, is the idea of if you have a very significant historic structure that needs significant rehabilitation and is going to cost money that you have not yet secured, the preservation approach would be to mothball the building, to put a secure roof on it, to secure the windows, to prevent vandalism, and in the hopes that funds could be raised or a project could be developed, a developer could be located to take on the rehabilitation of that property. But the difficulty in using HUD funds for those types of not mothballing exactly, but kind of situations where you are safeguarding the property in the hopes that future development could take place, is HUD requires that within 2 years of the expenditure of funds, the property needs to be put back into use. And anything that in HUD's eye is speculative, like hoping that someone will come along to rehabilitate a historic property after it has been safeguarded by, a new roof or by securing the building, is not a approach that that HUD funds makes possible. So unfortunately, it seems that once you have a blight situation that the community has decided to tackle, um, the constraints of HUD funds and the desires of historic preservation, or the intents of historic preservation and the concern for maintaining historic properties in the community, the programs don't often work well together. That it takes a pretty creative approach to figure out how short-term measures can be taken, or how you can, I mean, we have certainly in the past occasionally had successful marketing efforts where say a old school is being abandoned, and they actively market the property to developers. There's a lot of developers who are interested in converting schools into senior citizen housing or other things. But I would
And
say that, oh, go ahead.
that's because those developers can take advantage of a tax credit if the property's in a listed district. Let's say if it's listed, there's a 20% tax credit, 20% of the cost of rehabilitation that can be given back to them if they do the work in accordance with the standards. So that's one of the incentives or tools for marketing historic buildings for rehabilitation.
And
just wanted to interject that, Pam.
That's important to say. And that tax credit can be used in conjunction with low income tax credits, with senior housing tax credits, with a variety of other desired outcomes. So it can make a compelling financial incentive for developers to take on properties like that. I would say the key factor there is to pursue those outcomes before you are in a dire situation, where the
Mm.
building is virtually, on the edge of collapse, when the developer wants to can make the numbers work even with the tax incentives. So being proactive, being aware of opportunities that will be coming up in your communities for historic properties that are in need of a new use, of an adaptive reuse, and could take advantage of these tax incentives, is would certainly be the best advice.
Thank you. Are there any other additional questions? Thanks, Kristen. Okay, well, we did want to remind you that this is the last in a series of trainings that were intended to give you some tools to help you manage your Section 106 responsibilities and better understand them. And they've all been recorded and they're available on the PHMC YouTube channel. And those are a list of the past topics that we've presented. So I would encourage you to revisit those if you haven't been able to attend all of these trainings. They'll be up there and available for some time to come. So I would encourage you to check them out. And I really think we should thank Pam a great deal. She has spent a lot of time and energy putting these trainings together. And so Pam, thank you for all your hard work on these.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. You've certainly provided a lot of great guidance and helped me to remember all the points I should have thought of myself, maybe, and needed a little bit of a nudge to make sure I included. And I'd also like to urge everyone to feel free to contact me or contact others on staff if you have additional questions that you think of as you think over some of the information that was presented here today. I know, as